There is a debate going on across the country right now. It's raging over whether or not to allow kids to return back to school in the first place, let alone how to do that in the best, most effective way. This debate is stunning to me because of all the research for decades that shows that when kids are absent from school, it hurts them dramatically. It harms students when they are not in the classroom, when they are not educated by teachers, because they have a time period gap in their learning and they are just freshly getting their brains into action, learning how to read, learning how to write, learning how to do basic mathematics. We know that children being out of the educational environment harms their ability to learn and to grow mentally, intellectually. By third grade, research shows it is critical that children achieve some basic reading skills. Imagine a student who finished second grade through some remote online learning, with their parents simultaneously working, even working from home, trying to help them through it, but schools maybe didn't take attendance, heck of a lot didn't. It's hard to teach a 7-year-old kid over the internet and keep their attention span going. Look, I've been into dozens of fifth grade classes of 10-year-old kids, speaking to them about the U.S. Constitution. I may not have been a teacher myself, but I understand what it entails to captivate a classroom of 10-year-olds for an hour. And usually, I do have to say, keeping them participatory and quiet in terms of paying attention, but also very engaged and sometimes loud when we would have fun. But I digress. Bottom line is, it is not easy to maintain a classroom of kids in person. It's also very hard to maintain children's attention at a distance online. Imagine a second grade kid does their second half of the school year mostly from home, getting at most half the quality of education they normally would in the classroom, most likely, especially if a parent is only able to assist so much during the school day. There are a lot of parents who understandably and justifiably choose homeschooling. They do a lot to prepare for that. Very involved. They make the active decision. A lot of parents forced into this position. Now imagine that same second grade kid goes into third grade, and the first half of the third grade year, they're also out of the classroom. Imagine how much that child will lose from not being in school in a critical formative year when they're about 8 years old and in the third grade. It could be tremendously negative with long-lasting repercussions. And that's not even to talk about some of the other consequences of being absent from a school environment. As I've talked about with COVID-19, kids not being in school means that a lot of at-home abusive situations are not being identified by educators and by school counselors. You also have instances where, and I know this from my own personal experience, teachers help to identify if a child has eyesight issues. There are a lot of things that a teacher can understand and catch in the classroom that parents at home might not catch because the teachers are dealing with groups of kids every day. But also, there are things that the parents wouldn't report, perhaps, in some cases, at home abusive situations that teachers may catch. And the list goes on and on. The fact is that we need to bring children back to school. And don't just take my word for it. Let's listen to some top pediatricians, as reported on MSNBC of all places, in Cut 6, I'm surprised that MSNBC even allowed this story to air about a group of pediatricians across the country, 5 different pediatricians, they say randomly selected across the country, who were all advocates for children returning to school. And not just because of the classroom benefits, but because the likelihood of a child getting and spreading the virus, and especially being harmed from coronavirus, is very small. Take a look at this.
As schools struggle with reopening safely, NBC News reached out to 5 top pediatricians across the country, a random sampling of doctors, to find out just how dangerous the coronavirus is for kids. Our experts agree most children don't get as sick as adults and that serious complications are rare.
This has been a strange pandemic because usually for respiratory viruses, children are the first and the most substantially affected. And this has really been a flip of that, where it's our adults, and particularly our older adults, that have been more affected.
In fact, kids only account for 2% of all cases. Doctors say they don't expect that number to significantly increase when schools open because kids don't appear to be good at spreading the virus.
Are kids as good at transmitting the virus as adults?
The data that's come out now seems to show that most transmissions occur from adults to adults or adults to children.
The younger you are, probably the less likely you are to be able to transmit the disease.
While many teachers are concerned about reopening school so soon, the 5 doctors we spoke to agreed. The benefits of being in the classroom far outweigh the risk of disease. But the key is to reopen safely.
We are not seeing transmissions when we're following some simple guidelines.
I think each school system is going to have to come up with their own guidelines because you can't just say that one city is just like the next.
All agree guidelines should include rules for social distancing. Keep desks 3 to 6 feet apart and make sure desks aren't facing each other. Schools may want to consider holding gym classes outside.
In your perfect world of sending kids back to school, what would you like seeing set up in those school systems?
They should try to increase the airflow in the classrooms, try to distance as much as possible. I have been doing a lot of research looking into face masks. I don't think they're necessarily useful in elementary school children. They do provide protection, I think, for high school students.
Would you let your kids go back to school?
I will. My kids are looking forward to it.
Yes. Period. Absolutely.
Absolutely. As much as I can.
Without a hesitation.
Without a hesitation, yes.
I have no concerns about sending my child to school in the fall.
I would let my kids go back to school.
Dr. John Torres, NBC News.
They all said yes.
They all said yes. And the way in which he said that was, they all said yes. Like he's surprised. The Wall Street Journal has an excellent editorial out today where they point out the following, and I quote, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 30 children under age 15 have died from COVID-19. In a typical year, 190 children die of the flu, 436 from suicide, 625 from homicide, and 4,114 from unintentional deaths such as drowning. But let's go to the flu, 190 children dying of the flu. This is very different from the flu. We know this. But 30 children dying out of millions upon millions in this country is one indicator that children are not deeply threatened by reopening schools, especially if you put into place precautions. Also, in terms of hospitalizations and deaths, only 2 children under age 18 have died in Chicago. Fewer than were killed in shootings in a recent weekend. In New York City, 0.03% of children under 18 have been hospitalized for COVID, and 7.5 in 1 million have died. The death rate for those over 75 is more than 2,200 times higher than for those under 18. If we are going to say, no, kids cannot go to school until we have a vaccine, until we have a cure. They cannot go into the classroom until certain high bars are met. We might as well stop parents from driving their kids or allowing their kids to go swimming. Or even after the pandemic is gone, because of the flu, we need to stop sending them to schools. Now, what's so striking as well are those places in which they have kept schools open. In Sweden, which kept schools open, only 20 children under age 19, 0.6% of confirmed cases have been admitted to the ICU, and only one has died in a country where they have reopened schools. Now, teens do appear to be more infectious, the Wall Street Journal editorial board notes, yet schools that have reopened in most countries, including Germany, Singapore, Norway, Denmark, and Finland, haven't experienced outbreaks. Some schools in Israel had outbreaks last month after class sizes were increased, but most infections were in both teachers and students were mild. Mild infections. Then Betsy DeVos, Secretary of Education, whom I have, and I think this whole crisis reaffirms it, called the best Secretary of Education we've had since Bill Bennett in the 1980s. But Secretary DeVos has been blasted for saying we need to focus on reopening schools, but not providing specific guidelines on how to go about it, and saying this is how you need to go about it. Let's go to cut 3, where she's pressed a bit by Dana Bash on Sunday's State of the Union on CNN about local judgments in reopening schools.
So you're right. The AAP has said that the goal, of course, is for children to be back in school, but they also signed a letter saying schools in areas with high levels of COVID-19 community spread should not be compelled to reopen against the judgment of local experts. And it sounds like what you're saying is you, as the Secretary of Education, you are compelling schools to reopen regardless of what's happening.
No, what we're saying is that kids need to be back in school, and that school leaders across the country need to be making plans to do just that. There's going to be the exception to the rule, but the rule should be that kids go back to school this fall. And where there are little flare-ups or hotspots, that can be dealt with on a school-by-school or a case-by-case basis.
As the Secretary of Education, should schools in the United States follow the CDC recommendations or not?
Dr. Redfield has clearly said these are recommendations, and every situation is going to look slightly different. And the key for education leaders, and these are smart people who can figure things out, they can figure out what is going to be right for their specific situation, because every school building is different, every school population is different. If you have an elementary school or a middle school, or you have a K-12 campus.
But what I want to know is if the federal government is all on the same page. As the Secretary of Education, should schools
It's very
follow
much
the
on the
guidelines
same
of the
page.
CDC?
Kids need to get back to school. They need to get back in the classroom. Families need for kids to get back in the classroom, and it can be done safely.
Well,
there
okay,
are guidelines that are very clear, and also very acknowledging that situations are going to be different. But the rule has got to be that kids go to learning.
She's so right. And here's the thing about Secretary DeVos that the left just cannot understand. She's not somebody who actually comes into the Department of Education and says, hey, we're doing this across the country. This is the exact way that it needs to be done, and we're going to move forward with it. She doesn't have the ideology of top-down government control from the federal level, preferring that states and local communities have maximum discretion in a wide swath of areas, in the vast majority of areas. That's exactly what DeVos is saying here. We're setting the goal. Every school in this country and every school district in this country should strive to reopen for in-person learning for students. That's the goal nationally. Okay, good national goal. How are we going to achieve it? Well, that's where we get more localized. In cut 4, DeVos is further pressed by Dana Bash on her argument that the federal government shouldn't be dictating to schools how they go about the reopening, as though there's some kind of contradiction here.
You're the Secretary of Education. You're asking students to go back. So why do you not have guidance on what a school should do just weeks before you want those schools to reopen, on what happens if it faces an outbreak?
You know, there's really good examples that have been utilized in the private sector and elsewhere, also with frontline workers and hospitals. And all of that data and all of that information and all of those examples can be referenced by school leaders.
But I'm not hearing a plan from the Department of Education. Do you have a plan for what students and what schools should do?
So schools should do what's right on the ground at that time for their students and for their situation. There is no one uniform approach that we can take or should take nationwide.
But can I just ask you,
because the needs of a school in the city of Detroit are very, in my home state, in the city of Detroit, would be very different than that of a school in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan.
And that's the point. That's completely understandable. But you are arguing over and over that they should handle this on a local level. But at the same time, as the Secretary of Education, you are trying to push them to do a one-size-fits-all approach, which is go back and reopen schools. You can't have it both ways.
She's not having it both ways. Dana Bash isn't listening, isn't paying attention to what U.S. Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos is saying. She is saying not that there's a one-size-fits-all approach. In fact, no one uniform approach. That's the language that DeVos used there. No one unified approach. Yes, at the federal level, they are insisting that the goal needs to be, and they should, to reopen schools, especially when you have teachers' unions in this country who are advocating insane ideas for reopening. For example, let's go to Los Angeles, California. They want to defund the police and reallocate funds and push for Medicare for all in order to reopen schools in Los Angeles. What does that have to do with COVID-19? There are any number of reasons why one could understandably be concerned about sending kids to school and reopening. Defunding the police, Medicare for all, not one of them. They are essentially holding students' education hostage in Los Angeles, California. If you have local school districts that have unions who are insisting on that, then you do need some sort of guiding post saying, yes, you need to focus on reopening schools. You need that guidance from the federal government, but then allow each local community to make determinations. For example, I am here in Colorado, and one of the major school districts in Colorado is the Cherry Creek School District. They are reopening their schools for in-person learning with social distancing, with masks required where possible, those kinds of precautions taken. But they're also telling parents, you do not have to send your kids back to school if you don't want to. If you want them to be taught remotely, let us know. Let's get a head count for the number of kids, particularly the first semester. Let's get a head count for the number of kids that will be in the classroom so we can then determine how many teachers we need in the classroom versus how many teachers will be needed for online instruction. And by the way, those teachers are at higher risk, I would assume. I don't know this for a fact, but I would assume that Cherry Creek Schools is going to encourage those teachers at higher risk for COVID-19 to be the online educators. That is a smart way to do it. Now, we can have a discussion about masks and whether they're useful with kids or not. The point is that here you've got a major school district in the state of Colorado, just as one example I'm familiar with. I grew up and went to Cherokee School District. That is saying, we're reopening. You don't have to send your kids to the schools, but we're taking precautions if you do. And we need a head count so we can determine how many are going to be online and how many are going to be in the classroom. This is exactly why the federal government giving specific regulations and restrictions is wrong. Betsy DeVos is spot on here. She understands the role of the federal government to the extent that there is one under the federal law as it exists today. The role of the federal government is to set big picture targets and then to allow those local schools and school districts to make those decisions. But setting that big picture target when you've got a school district like Los Angeles, where education is being held hostage by a teachers union that doesn't want to send their kids back to school or have their kids and teachers go back because they want to defund the police, that shows you need some sort of federal guidance in this circumstance, but not getting specific. And they haven't actually put forward a plan to compel school districts to bring their students back to start up school yet. But what they should do at the federal level is if there are schools open in a given community and a child's main school is not open and that parent would like to send their child to school, federal funds and state funds, by the way, should follow that student to the school of that student's choice. Don't punish the student because that school or school district has made the decision not to open and to thereby deny that kid access to his school. Allow, as we talked with Corey DeAngelis on Friday from the Reason Foundation. Actually, that was from my radio show. But Corey DeAngelis from the Reason Foundation has made the point that we need to have the money follow the student more in that way. The left is maligning and attacking Betsy DeVos. Folks, she's spot on here. She understands the necessity of reopening schools. And I'll leave you with the final statistic, and then we'll go to a break. Philadelphia superintendent, this is according to the Wall Street Journal editorial, William Haidt, warned that kids were falling through the cracks, which could portend an increase in youth delinquency and crime. Research outfit NWEA has projected that, quote, students are likely to return in fall 2020 with approximately 63 to 68% of the learning gains in reading relative to a typical school year, and with 37 to 50% of the learning gains in math. Another half year or year of lost instruction will be impossible to make up. Here's the reality. Betsy DeVos's detractors of her as Secretary of Education say she doesn't care about students. She doesn't care about the quality of education. She's the one trying to ensure that kids across this country are actually getting an education in the classroom as much as possible. And she's letting the local communities, rightly so, make that decision because she understands that local communities, school boards, and parents know their students best, know their situations best, and yes, have local health experts who can provide them with appropriate guidance and guidelines for the circumstances that their communities face. Don't allow the media to mislead you on this one. Just don't. You just watched a clip from Jimmy at the Crossroads. Don't miss more engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel today. You want to catch our live show. And I love your support.
I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.